The Mama Chats. Welcome to podcast.
Hi, welcome to This Mama Chats. My name is Sarah. I am a mum of two and I own 2 childcare centres. So I started this podcast because I really love talking about like all things early childhood. I love talking about kids. I love talking about parenting, educational styles, pedagogy, stuff like that. So one of the things I really like talking to my friends about is how we get to curate our child's childhood. And you know, I talk about this from like a respecting different types of parenting styles as well. And this is particularly important in the early childhood space because there are a lot of things that we do throughout the day that, you know, we have to adjust depending on what parents want, you know, from dietary requirements, sleep, bottles, you know, like sunscreen. Like there's lots of different like little things, not big things, but little things that we take into account because of different parenting styles and what parents want, which obviously is really important. But also it's just like it's a really cool and beautiful thing that we kind of forget sometimes as parents, you know, like we stress so much and we judge ourselves, you know, we're our harshest critics a lot of the time. And, you know, people also judge other parents for it, you know, when they shouldn't. But it's something that I feel like we are hard on ourselves about because, you know, we judge how we are like parenting or decisions that we're making and we don't try and think about it from a perspective of empowerment. Like, it's actually really cool that we get to make these choices about how we parent our kids, where they go to school, where they go to kindy, you know, the environments and the influences that they have in their world outside of just what their nuclear family looks like, whatever that looks like, you know. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, you know, the different things we can choose and how kindy plays a role in that for me. So obviously I worked in childcare before I had kids and I fell in love with early childhood as someone that didn't have children and I, you know, hadn't been around a lot of kids. I had cousins in my family and, you know, like I had a lot of younger cousins. Like we've got an age gap of about 12 years between me, I'm the eldest, and my youngest cousin. But, you know, it's different obviously to taking care of little kids when you're like an 18-year-old girl. So I loved it. And one of the things I loved is like the way that we can introduce like exciting things into their world that they might not think about. So when we think about curating their childhood, one of the things I like to say to people is like we get to choose what their childhood looks like. We get to design their childhood. And I feel like, you know, that's a really exciting and empowering thing as a parent. A lot of the time we judge ourselves, like I said before, we judge ourselves on these things, but really it's like, you know, it's beautiful. And if you try and take the stress away from it and you just take a deep breath and you think, okay, what do I really want for my kids? You know, like even though it might be a hard decision or it might be something you're struggling with, you know, like screen time, I think is a great example. You know, like you can think about those things from like a more holistic perspective rather being in the depth, like, you know, in the deep of it. So going back to kindy, you know, like we get to do these, you know, exciting things throughout the day that introduce, you know, like concepts that they might not have at home. You know, like we talk about gravity when we're doing like, you know, stuff with cars and putting things on ramps, you know, and boys like to, you know, like boys love to play with cars and they love to like push them down the slide, and we get to talk about gravity and we get to talk about force and, you know, like those sorts of space and science and mathematical concepts and things like that, and introduce things like that. So, you know, from an educational perspective, obviously there's like lots of different concepts and ideas that you can, you know, introduce to your child's childhood to enrich their experience. But then, you know, just as a parent, one of the things that I think we forget is the different types of days that they have and different environments. So, you know, one of the things I say to people when we talk about kindy and we talk about, you know, the routine, and we don't really call it like structure, we try and call it a rhythm now. It's not a hard and fast structure, so it's more like a rhythm of the day, is that children get to experience different environments. So, you know, they get to learn how to be in different environments and different things that they can do. And we might be able to do, you know, like bush tea or damper or like roast marshmallows and things like that. And that might be something that you want for your children. And then, you know, like screen time is a big one as well. You know, there's a lot of research and a lot of controversial stuff about zero screen time or like unlimited screen time and, you know, high stimulating shows and like low stimulating shows. And, you know, like I feel like I could do an episode, I guess, just on, you know, which shows I let my children watch and which ones I don't. And I think it might surprise people that how I am about screen time at kindy is really different to how I approach screen time at home. And this comes from this idea of like how I want to curate my child's experience and their childhood. So when they're at kindy and it's all about play and it's all about them them building relationships with their friends, I want them to be in the moment and I I want them to be present, and I don't feel like it's necessary for us to have screens at kindy. Like there should be, like, we don't need to watch movies. We don't need to be doing games on the iPads or like, doing computer games, like early computer games, or like tracing stuff on the iPads for literacy. Like I don't think any of that is really necessary at kindy. It can be a screen-free environment, kindy. But then for my child, like for my child's childhood in general, that doesn't mean that I want their whole entire childhood to be screen-free. And I think about this from a perspective of like, I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons when I was a teenager. And so now, like as a millennial, there's all these like pop culture references and stuff that like I just don't really get because I didn't watch that. And so I feel like for me, when I think about my child's screen time, I'm happy for them to have a little bit of it. But at the same time, if other parents don't want their children to have any screen time, that is the beauty when we talk about being able to curate your own child's childhood. You are allowed to make those decisions. And we should think about it from that perspective of curating their childhood and not judging other parenting perspectives. Because we need to remember, I say this, this is something we talk about at work a lot, because obviously in childcare we have to respect different parenting views, and it's a really big thing for us getting to know the family to understand how they want things done for their child. Is that, we want there to be different people in the world, right? Like if everybody was raised the same, then we would get a lot of similar people. So it's really beautiful that we're going to have a lot of different types of parenting and a lot of different types of childhood. So people will grow up and be different and we'll have a diverse community. I guess going back to like how I curate my child's childhood at kindy versus at home. At home, we do let them watch a little bit of screen time, and we do let them have, their favorite shows. And that's something that I find at kindy, we do not do it and I don't like it. But at home, it's nice for them to like, have a big day of kindy, or, when we go out and we, have family days and then we come home and we relax. Because even like me and my husband, and as adults, like sometimes you just as an adult want to come home and just watch the TV for a little bit, and you want to just like relax. And, enjoying and sharing a show is like sharing a book or sharing a play experience. And I love playing with my kids too, but I also love when, like when my daughter wants to watch Frozen and we get to like sit down and like watch, the quintessential like princess, like Disney princess movie. That's a really nice thing to share. And when I think back about my childhood, and I think about the childhood I want my children to have, curating their childhood. I want them to have a childhood where they remember having movie nights and where they remember like having their favorite character, and then the family supporting that and being like, when you see a Frozen, when we see something that's like one of their favorite characters, it's like, oh, look, there's Mario, or there's like Elsa, and, those things. It's a cute part of childhood too. I don't think we need to demonize it all the time. So yeah, I just think that when we talk about curating their childhood, we forget that it's a really cool thing and that it's something that comes from a place of power. And I feel that if people are really feeling like stressed about decisions that they're making, I think you should just like, from a parenting perspective, I feel like if you just take a step back and take a deep breath and you think, okay, well, what kind of childhood do I want them to have? Do I want them to have one where there's no rules, or do I want them to have one where, have unlimited screen time, or whatever it is? And I think if you think about it from that holistic perspective, it brings that empowerment back as well. And it also reminds you that you don't have to parent exact same way as your best friends or your sister or your brother or your mum or like even people that you might look up to. Like there's a lot of influencers and stuff out there that do a lot of really cool parenting stuff. And, like obviously like the whole world schooling and like homeschooling and all of that is becoming a lot more popular online. And there's some things that you see that are really beautiful and really aesthetic. And like, I love the idea of that. But I also know from a practical perspective, from where we live on the Gold Coast, and it's not something that we are going to be able to achieve for our family. It's also trying to think like from a practical perspective, what are the things that I can do, and how can I influence my child's childhood for it to be the way I want it to be? And that's where kindy comes into it for us and for a lot of families, I think too, because a lot of people naturally want their child's childhood to be fun and to be full of excitement and to be full of friends and be full of learning and confidence and learning to take risks and, like sharing, music and dance and art and science and like, getting messy and like all of those things that come into your brain when you think about childhood. And a lot of those things we can do at home, and we do, but some of it's just easier to do at kindy. And when if they are going to kindy, I think you probably also have the feeling of like they've had a whole day of just play. They've had a whole day of doing what children should be doing, getting messy, running around, talking to their friends. To me, that's how childhood should look. It doesn't need to look like that 24/7. Don't get me wrong. Like, obviously, I want their childhood to also be enriched by them being with their family and them being with their grandparents and them being with their families' friends. Like, I love it when we get together with our friends and we go out somewhere and, all the adults are sitting together and all the kids are off playing together on a footy field or whatever. Like, all those moments are equally as important. But I think we need to think about childhood from this perspective of what are the different experiences you want your child to have and how can we help make that happen. So when we talk about curating your child's childhood, obviously there's going to be some people that are like, yeah, well, that's why I'm anti-daycare, because I don't want their childhood to be full of daycare and I want to keep them at home. And that's totally fine. If that's how you feel, like that's what you should do, and this goes back to the idea of you are the parent and you get to curate their childhood and you get to decide what kind of experiences they have and which ones they don't. Like, that's the beauty of being a parent, is that you should be able to make those choices. But I also think that there is a place for daycare in a lot of people's imagination as to what their child's dream childhood looks like, because of the friendships and because of the unlimited play and because of the beauty of the environment being designed for them with all the resources at their level, and us thinking about, what's going to make their brains excited when they come in. If they've got a really big interest in dinosaurs, we might have a big dinosaur display. This goes back to the idea of you get to choose how you want your child's childhood to look. And for a lot of people, I think play in a group and play with their friends, it plays into that. And I think the other thing that when we talk about curating their childhood, I think the other thing that comes into that is also thinking about learning from different people and having different influences, right? So something that my husband and I talk about a lot is how we love that there are so many people in my children's lives that their faces light up, that my children's faces light up, but also the adults' faces light up when they see them. And that feeling of having your child surrounded by a lot of people that love them and care for them and are excited to see them is something that I want my children to have. I want my children and all children, if I could, all children should. And, it's a travesty and the most, it's the saddest part that maybe not all children have this, but all children should feel like they are surrounded by so much love and by so many adults that are excited to see them and want to hear what they say and are interested in, playing with them. And to be able to have an environment where they have that at home and with their grandparents, and in an environment where they're at kindy and they have that with educators and they have that with friends, for me is my child's ideal childhood. And so, I feel very blessed and very grateful that we can do that. And I should say, for people that feel like you're not empowered to make those parenting decisions, or you're listening to this, or the idea of like being able to curate your child's childhoods feels like that's like out of reach for you. But I think it's important to remember that there are different ways you can empower yourself too. If you're anti-daycare, like I would also recommend, finding play groups and things like that. I mean, I feel like for me, it's a little bit different because I want my children to have a childhood where they're really confident, and I want them to feel that confidence even when I'm not there, because for me, that's a way that I think I keep my children safe, is that they're confident to call things out. They're confident to feel emotions. They're confident to read their body and to know when they feel safe and when they don't. And that's not determined by me or my husband being there. And I know that when my kids are at kindy and when they're at the playground and when they're with their grandparents, I see that in how they move around the spaces, that they are confident and that they're happy and they're independent. And that's something that's really important to me and something that I want my children to have, is that independence. Because for me, that's what I want for my kids. And, this goes back to the idea of you can curate your child's childhood. Like, you get to decide how the things about them that you want to support, if they've got particular skills. When they're older, you get to decide, which ones you encourage and which ones maybe you encourage less. But in a really early stage, for me, it's about my children feeling that support and love from lots of different people and having the influences of those different people. For me and for my husband, we love that our kids have those different influences, and it might be, like from a grandparent. So like when my dad comes over, he's very different with my kids than what I am. The kind of play that they do is different. And I think that that's really beautiful. And I think that's also how kids learn to read social cues, and how they become really socialized is by mixing with with different people in a safe environment and playing with their friends and learning cues from their friends of when can they play, what are games that they want to play alone and what are games that they want to join in on, and all of those things, and just having a really rich childhood where they get lots of different experiences and lots of different influences is something that's really important to me. And I feel like I'm biased, but I feel like, kindy plays a big part in that in a way that maybe play groups don't, because we're not there to be that safety net. And I feel like without that safety net is when they really get the confidence and when they really come out of their shell and learn how to be when mum and dad aren't watching them. When you think about kids being teenagers and when they start to make those decisions when we're not there. When they're at home, we have a craft table outside because I love doing arts and crafts, and I'll set them up on the table outside, and sometimes I'll come into the kitchen and I just spy on them from through the window. And I'm sure a lot of parents do this too. And you watch what they're like when you're not there. And it's beautiful to see that there's not much difference in how they act. And, even when my kids argue and when they, as siblings do, even if I'm not there and I'm I can see that it's about to kind of kick off, the way that they respond to each other, my son and my daughter, I can tell that they've had a lot of that emotional regulation training from me, but also from reinforced from kindy, because, they'll say to each other, my son, he's 4, he'll say to my daughter, I'm sorry for how I made you feel. Are you feeling a little bit sad? Do you want space? And that kind of language is not something that a lot of us as parents grew up with. Obviously parenting has changed a lot, and, the way we talk about mental health and emotions, emotional regulation has changed. But this is the other thing about curating their childhood is I want my children to have a really strong sense of, emotional regulation at this point, so that later on in life, when life throws them those hurdles that life just does, they're coming at it from a place of, they've got the emotional resilience tools to deal with, the inevitable mental health stuff that happens, when you're an adult and in life. And to have those sorts of lessons reinforced by different people, I think is something that's also really important to me. And this is the other thing that I feel like kindy gets to give my children, other children, is that reinforcement of ideas that you learn from home, but sometimes it's you just need to hear it how we learn. We need to hear it multiple times and in lots of different ways, and different styles connect with people differently, and little children are the exact same. And it's on us to try and understand as educators, it's on us to try and understand who learns differently and how we can support that. Talking about curating their childhood, for me, I always wanted my children to have siblings, and I always really wanted them to have cousins. I grew up really, really close to my cousins and my brother, and it was so important to me that my kids had that too, because I was always really close with my family, and obviously family is something that's important to me, as it is to a lot of people. And so I really wanted my son to have a really strong relationship with his sister and his cousins. And so having that time for them together at kindy and also at home at play, when we go to the park and stuff, is something that's really important. So I really love that when they're at my centres, and this is something we do at my centres, is we try and support the sibling relationship or cousin relationship, any kind of family dynamic relationships that we have a lot, which means my children get to visit each other. And, other children at our centre that have siblings, they get to visit each other during the day, because for me, it's important that when they're at kindy, they still get to see each other the way that they would see each other at home. And that's not to say that they spend in the other child's class for the whole day or anything like that, but there's just moments throughout the day that they get to share together and that they get to introduce each other to their friends. So, my son, he loves when my daughter goes to visit him in the preschool room, and then he gets to show his preschool friends his little sister, and that's something that's really cute. And I think that is something that pride about your relationship is something that from a really young age we have tried to instill with them. I don't think that that's necessarily uncommon, but when we talk about curating their childhood, it's also this idea of, I want my children to see their sibling as their teammate and as their best friend, and not as someone that they're in competition with, or, this idea that siblings fight. Of course they do. That's one of the relationships that they learn how to regulate, and they learn how to deal with the fight and how to repair afterwards, right? So for me, for them to have a childhood where they get to have a lot of time together in different environments as well, so they can practice the things that we teach them about keeping each other safe and about standing up for one another. And again, this goes to thinking long term. And when I think about curating my child's childhood, I am thinking long term. I'm thinking about how I want it to look now and how I want it to look in preteen and how I want it to look in adolescence. And so I do think about those little seeds that we can plant now. Like I say to my son and my daughter when they're wrestling, I say to them, like, are they laughing? Is that a happy laugh? What is their body telling you? It's not just about the verbal cues like, yes and no. It's also about body language. And, when we're at a playground or, when we go out with our friends and all the kids are on the footy oval, I'll say to them, where's your sister? Where's your brother? Does she look like she's happy? Does she look like she's safe? And having those conversations. And that's something that I want for their childhood too, is I want them to feel like they are a team, but it's also not pressure, but this idea that as a team, their job is to keep each other safe. Like that's our family's job. Our family's job is to keep each other safe. That is our job as parents, our job is to keep you safe. And, from an age appropriate perspective, obviously, we're not putting undue responsibility on them. But, the idea of like, if you're at the playground and, one of them is like struggling on the swing, the other should go and help them, right? Like that's the kind of childhood I want them to have. I want them to help each other and I want them to remember being able to do that as well. Like I want them to look back on their memories and be like, we had a really great relationship and my brother helped me and my sister helped me. And yeah, I just, I think that that's something that is really beautiful too, is watching the sibling relationship and being able to support it to be a sibling relationship that you want them to have. I don't want it to be I don't want it to be full of competition and I don't want it to be like at arm's length. I want them to be really solid and really close so that hopefully that will last for their entire life, even when we're no longer here. Things other, when we talk about curating our childhood is obviously food. So for me, I really I love food and I'm not someone that's really strict about what I eat as an adult. I try and be just generally really balanced about it. And I think how I am with kindy and how I am about it at home is two totally different things. At kindy, I like to say our job at kindy is for it to be a treat-free, a sugar-free, as healthy as possible. Like kindy should be a safe space for healthy eating, right? So that when we're at home, as parents, we can give the treats and stuff like that. And at my centres, we provide all the food. And at my Eleonora Centre on the Gold Coast, we cook as much organic as we can because I really think, organic meat and dairy in particular is really important. And it's a lot easier for us to do that on the Gold Coast than it is for us to do that in Blackbutt. So we do that on the Gold Coast. And for me, it's great that I get to know that my children are having a lot of wholesome meals as part of their childhood that I might not necessarily be able to cook every day. So going back to how we curate their childhood is, for me, I would love them to have a childhood where every day they're eating amazing, organic, nourishing, well-balanced food. And when they're at kindy, they do. But it's, being practical, it's probably not something that I'm going to be able to achieve every day for me when they're at home. But it does mean that they do get a really, for me, I'm happy for them to have a balance. So they eat a lot of really nourishing food at home and they eat a lot of nourishing organic food at kindy at the centre in Eleonora. And then when we're at home, I mean, obviously we cook most of our food too. But what I mean is we also give them, we do give them treats. We do let them have ice creams and we do when we're on holiday, let them have more treats than they normally would. And this is for me because I want them to have a childhood. For me, I think it's like a rite of passage having an ice cream and having birthday, having cookies with their baby chinos and things like that. I just think on balance, I don't think that there's a lot of harm in us doing that on the odd occasion when we're at home and kindy helps balance that out because they have so much organic, healthy, wholesome meals. Food is another really important thing, I guess, when we're thinking about how we curate their childhood. But I think that one for me is very much about balance and kindy really helps me with that. It's really important to me that my kids get to experiment with risky play and that they get to make judgment calls and risk assessment on their own without me always intervening. And this is something that I guess maybe having a boy first, he always wanted to climb and he always was full steam ahead. And my daughter is a little bit like me, quite uncoordinated. And so I feel like I want them to be able to make these calls about what they climb on and what they don't, and think about it from a risk assessment perspective, so that just naturally as they grow older, they have that thought process in their head about risks, and it not always just being like, oh, I'm not allowed to do that because mum said no, or dad said no, or it's too high, or whatever. I want them to be able to think about it from a perspective where they're going to be able to take those lessons into later life and not miss out on, the risky play that when, back in our day, we were allowed to do those things. And, you saw a lot of kids with more broken arms and from playing on swings and playing in trees and stuff like that. And I'm not saying broken bones are good at all, but what I'm saying is I feel like I want my children to have that. I want them to have a bit of risky play. And so I love that they get to experiment with that within the safe parameters of the kindy having all the soft formats and climbing equipment and things like that. And they get to watch their friends do it, so they learn different techniques and role modeling how they do things properly. And I love that they also get to play and experiment with different types of equipment, because again, going back to if you are a parent that has an amazing at-home setup and you have all the climbing equipment and you have the fort and you have all of that stuff, that's great. But for me, where I live on the Gold Coast, I love being able to take them to different parks, and I love them being able to have different equipment, and it not always being the same thing that we have at home. At kindy, we can change it, how it was set up regularly, and so that it feels different and that they get to make different decisions. And decision-making skill is something that's really important to me that they learn early on in their childhood. And again, they practice it in different environments is something that I think I really want them to have. I really want them to have that risky play experience and, the fun of that, and to not have me always there sort of making a decision for them. I try to say to my son, not so much my daughter because she's 2, but my son, I try and say to him, does this feel safe to you? What's your plan? What's your plan here? And then I try and, to the best of my ability and within the parameters of being safe, let him make decisions about what he's going to experiment with, because it's really important to me that my kids also are in charge of their own childhood. And if he's confident and he's a child that wants to try these things, then I don't want to put my fear or mother henning over top of that. I feel like this also goes to the idea of looking at your child and thinking, what are their personalities? If you have a child that's not their personality, then that's obviously that's beautiful and they're going to be interested in doing other things and you're going to support that. But I have a child who, he's a bit of a typical boy and he likes to climb on stuff and jump and, experiment in those ways. And so for me, I want to support him have that kind of childhood where he's going to do those things. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about when I think about my child's childhood and the childhood that I want them to have is we've spoken about all the beautiful things, the risky play, the sibling relationships, the different influences, different, adult influences and relationships. But I also want them to experience frustration, and I want them to experience having to deal with difficult things and being told no. And it's not just not today. Sometimes it's just a no, and I want them to get used to dealing with that. I want them to get used to having to do things every day they don't want to do. So my son, he's 4 now, and he says to me sometimes, Mummy, every day we have to do things we don't want to do. And I say, that's right, because I've said that to him from such a young age. When he used to say, I don't want to do that or whatever, my answer back to that would be, every day we have to do things we don't want to do. And you can't always be happy, just like you can't always be sad. I want them to have a beautiful childhood, but I also want them to have a realistic understanding of life, that they can't be happy 100% of the time. It cannot always be sunshine and rainbows. And I want them to experience frustration so they know how to deal with it, and so that it's not this big deal that we have to deal with later. And I want them to have it in really micro little doses when they're young, so that when they're older, it's so much easier for them to overcome those feelings, to deal with the frustration. So, sometimes I just say no for the sake of it, versus sometimes I also just say yes because I give in, because I'm tired and I don't want to have the fight, and so sometimes I'll just say yes to something that I wouldn't normally. On other days, when I feel like I've got the energy to have the fight or stand my ground with this one, I might just say no to something, even though sometimes I might say yes because I'm like, well, I want you to learn that you can't always have those biscuits at 10 o'clock in the morning. So today I'm just going to say no. And you're just going to have to learn to deal with that because it's not a big deal. And no is part of life and dealing with frustration is part of life. And you're just not always going to get what you want. And I think that's a really important lesson for them to learn. And I think that, this is something they also get at kindy as being part of a group, is that they learn this idea of they are a member of a community and they are a member of a group, and they have to learn how to take their turn, and they have to wait and be respectful, and those sorts of skills, humility, politeness, kindness. It's really important to me that they get to practice dealing with frustration in different circumstances and with different people, and that they get to relearn and get to practice, in different experience. Yeah. It's really important to me that my children learn how to deal with frustration and, some of those negative emotions and things like, natural everyday challenges that life is going to throw at you, that they do have a little bit of that and they do learn those life skills, because life skills are part of life. And it's really important to me that they have a childhood that supports that, because I want them to be really capable adults and I want them to be really capable preteens and adolescents. I just want them to have a really enriched childhood so that they become really capable adults. And our job as parents is to support them so that they can be successful without us and that they don't need us all the time. And so trying to expose them to those, emotions is something that I think is really important. And for me to be able to have control over introducing and, intentionally, not just introducing, but like I was saying before, intentionally planting frustration into my children's day so that they have to deal with it, is something that I think is, for me, something that I want them to experience as part of their childhood. There's a lot of different things that we could talk about when we talk about curating a child's childhood. And I also want my children to travel, and I want them to learn different languages, and I want them to learn how to respect people. I feel like you could talk about this for a really long time, but the style of this podcast is I kind of just come in and I brain dump it. I don't have a lot of notes. It's supposed to be casual. It's supposed to be sort of off the cuff. So if there's, particular things that you disagree with, I would love to hear about it. And, likewise, if there's things that you agree with, I would like to hear about it, because one of the main reasons why I wanted to do this podcast is because I love talking about parenting. I love talking about kids, and I love hearing different people's perspectives and reflecting on, is that going to change how I parent? Or, what can I take away from that experience? Or how could that apply to my child or to my centers? I'm here because I love chatting about it. So I would love to hear back from you guys if there's, particular things that you agree or disagree with. So thank you for listening to this Mama Chats.